Now, just moments after conservative political activist Charlie Kirk was shot, videos of his assassination reached millions across the globe. This is just one example of the alarming spread of violent content. New York Times reporter Sheera Frenkel joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss this phenomenon and the failure of companies to regulate the issue. And a note, this conversation took place before President Trump filed a defamation lawsuit against the New York Times.
Bianna, thanks. Sheera Frenkel, thanks so much for joining us. Just last week, within moments of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we saw videos of that instant gain so many views on different social media platforms. And I guess the first question is why?
We see this almost every time that there's a violent incident caught on camera. People want to know what happened, and there's a kind of a morbid fascination to see it for themselves. If the incident happened in public, if there was a moment of violence that happened in public, you can be sure these days that someone was recording. And those videos seem to take less and less time to find their way to social media.
You know, people opened up their phone and opened and clicked on an app, and then it was just like, there wasn't even a choice. It was just there in their face. It was automatically playing.
I think what was so important about what you just said was the word choice. People had to choose to watch this sort of content even, 15, 20 years ago. You had to navigate to it. You had to select. You had to make a decision to say, I want to watch something violent, and click your way through to that, even in the earliest days of the internet. These days, as you said, you just open up a social media app, and it could be Instagram to see what your friends are doing. It could be X because you want to check a news bulletin. It could be any of these sites. And these videos autoplay. Almost all of the social media sites have put in a function where automatically, when you're using their platform, videos will autoplay. And they do that because it's good for engagement. It's good for their numbers. It's good for their metrics to have a video just automatically showing in your feed. Unfortunately, in this case, the video was an incredibly sort of gruesome and bloody view of a man's death, of the moment a person was killed. And people did not get that choice to say, I want to watch this or I don't want to watch it, unless you happen to be incredibly quick and navigate away from it. But at least in my case, I know when I opened up X, I didn't know what I was first watching when the video played. Just, you saw Charlie Kirk sitting there, and the next moment you saw his death.
Look, you have covered this for a number of years now, and put this in some perspective for us. The context of these kinds of videos, especially on social media, how has it evolved over the years? Because this isn't the first and probably won't be the last.
Yeah, as a reporter, I've covered this for going on a decade at this point. And in the very early days of really sort of violent videos making their way to social media, for me at least, my remembrance of that was ISIS. There was a time when the extremist Islamist group that was trying to conquer Iraq and Syria were posting very, very graphic footage on what was then called Twitter, of beheadings, of shootings, of people being thrown off buildings. And a number of social media companies got together, this was about a decade ago, and said, we're not going to allow this. We're going to put an end to it. We're going to stop violent content from spreading on our site because we don't think that's good and healthy for society. And you heard them very sort of earnestly say that they were going to do something about this type of content. In the 10 years since then, I think I've written 8 stories about the way that violent footage has spread online after an event, after whether it's an assassination or a school shooting or some other sort of tragic event. And every single time the social media companies say they're taking action, and we hear a lot of promises, and yet these videos continue to circulate.
So if they've known about this, if they've made public pledges to do better, is there a way to measure whether or not they are? Because most of us see another example of a lack of responsibility, that whatever tool that they built didn't work well enough.
So in the cases of some platforms, and here I'm thinking about Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, and Google, which owns YouTube, we have seen in the days following Charlie Kirk's death a number of labels put on these videos. So there's a warning for people saying, hey, this is violent content. And some age restriction has been put in place asking that people are over the age of 18 before they watch that. So we are seeing, I would say, some incremental steps from some of the companies. I would note, however, that the X, which used to be called Twitter, has taken a very different approach. They are not labeling the content. In fact, their owner, Elon Musk, has been sharing a great deal about this moment. And those videos are very widely available on X, where they autoplay. and I think have been viewed tens of millions of times at this point. So I think people who study the internet look at that and say, it's not enough for just some of the platforms to be doing something. As long as this lives in one platform that is accessed by billions of people all over the world, it's going to make its way everywhere. It's going to spread everywhere. People are going to share it. People are going to watch it.
So how much of this, I guess this specific video and its far reach has to do with the politics of the day and whether or not platforms want to be seen as censoring content versus letting it run? How much of it has to do with who Charlie Kirk was specifically?
It's clear we're living in a deeply polarized moment where people are going to point to this specific tragedy and say, you know, someone was assassinated, and that's a tragedy. Or they're going to point to it and say someone was assassinated. That proves what he had to say or disproves what he had to say. Everyone is kind of looking at this event and saying, drawing a conclusion from it, as it were. I think that, again, I look at psychologists, and especially child psychologists, who speak a lot about what watching violent footage does to our brains. And especially for young people, especially for people who are perhaps not opting to watch this, who it could trigger trauma in them. There's no doubt that psychologists do not think it's good for us to be watching violent content. And that for the people that are arguing that this furthers a goal, that this furthers an agenda on the right or the left, I think those psychologists would say that there should be discussion at this point in time, that political assassinations are something we should be really thinking seriously about as a society. But watching a moment of violence is not really going to advance anyone's agenda.
And have any of these platforms chosen to remove the video outright?
Some of the platforms, Meta and YouTube, as far as I know, have removed versions of the video, have labeled versions of the video. I think the ones that I saw that were removed were ones which were manipulated to make the footage even more gruesome. And so I think I've only seen a handful that were actually removed. For the most part, they've just labeled them.
I also wonder technologically how feasible that is. I mean, if it's a digital artifact, pretty easy, so to speak, to copy and paste it and upload it again, right? And I'm sure they probably have better stats on how often or how many variations of that same video are being uploaded.
Right. I mean, inevitably, whenever one of these moments happens, we hear from social media companies how quickly people uploaded those videos and how many millions of times those videos were manipulated or shared or tweaked in some way to make them spread further online. I think that when people decide to share content, it's very, very hard for the social media companies to take them down in their entirety.
So is there a through line into why people choose to share something like this? I mean, what are the rationales? What are the reasons? Why do people think that it's important for it to exist in the digital space or even as an archived moment?
I've seen people who post this video online say that they're sharing it because they think it proves their political agenda. What's interesting is I've seen people both on the right and the left make that claim. I've seen people on the left say that it shows that the person who decided to kill Charlie Kirk was a conservative person, a right-winger, gun owner, and therefore it proved X, Y, and Z about their political views. I've seen people on the right say that they're sharing it because they see Charlie Kirk as a martyr and because they want his moment of death to serve as some kind of political warning. You know, I think people can justify the sharing of violent videos in lots of different ways if they think it furthers their cause.
You know, recently we had the Utah Governor Spencer Cox say that social media is a cancer on our society right now. And I wonder, as people look at these platforms to try to take more steps to prevent this sort of proliferation of this type of video, is there any kind of collective sense of responsibility that they have with the executives that you speak with? Because it ultimately adds to their bottom lines. They profit from the virality of these images, these videos. It increases their, as you said, engagement, the time on site, the metrics that advertisers look for to see if I should invest in putting ads in a platform.
I think that depends on how cynically you want to look at the words and the public kind of speeches that have been given by some of these executives at companies like Google and Meta and TikTok. They all talk about how important it is to them to reduce hate speech, reduce disinformation, reduce violent content. And 5-6 years ago, we even saw them joining global forums to kind of stop this content from being spread. We heard Mark Zuckerberg talk about the thousands of people that were being hired at Meta to try and stop this problem. And yet the problem persists. And then I think you have to ask yourself, well, is it as important to them as developing AI? Is it as important to them as superintelligence? Are they dedicating anywhere near the amount of resources that they spend dedicated to data centers or to something else? And I think, you can pretty quickly come to the conclusion that it's not. That the amount of money that have been spent by the tech companies on other projects doesn't come close to what they've spent at tackling disinformation, hate speech, and violent content online. And so have they done something? Yes, they've applied labels, they've put in age restrictions, they've done some work towards, labeling these videos. But you cannot look at this and say that this is a problem that's been solved.
Meta and X have decreased the number of human beings involved in their trust and safety departments, right? I mean, maybe for different motivations, but compared to the amount of money that these companies are spending right now on AI chips and data centers, scaling back on the ability for humans to be smart about this and help in the process of taking these videos down seems directly oppositional to what they say in front of Congress.
Exactly. I think that all the tech companies have reduced the number of people that work on trust and safety, and some, like X, I think have gotten rid of them entirely. And so you see where they're spending money, where they're developing resources. I would note that the trust and safety people were typically the people at these companies that were at the forefront of saying, this is good for the platform, this is good for engagement, this is bad for engagement, this is bad for the platform. And they were the ones that were some of the most outspoken kind of opponents to some of the policies put in place by executives that they thought would increase engagement, but perhaps affect the overall health of the platform.
In those hours right after, when we don't exactly know what happened, it just seems like there's just so much conspiracy theory. In this case, help our audience understand what happened, to different people who were thought to be the suspects, the suspected shooter, even well before that shooter was actually identified.
There's always a bit of an internet manhunt that happens after these moments in time where people get together, whether it's on X or on Reddit or on Discord, and decide that they're going to be the ones that find the shooter. They're going to be the ones that figure out. And sometimes they're looking at photos of the event and saying, oh, well, that person, that looks like a popular YouTuber that we don't like, or that looks like a TikTok influencer. And you see them sort of gather around, and you see quite a bit of a witch hunt happening in those moments where individuals are targeted and blamed. In the hours after the Kirk shooting, we saw this. I think I saw 6 or 7 different people being named as suspects, and some of those people had their places of work called. They had their homes called. They, of course, had their internet profiles made public as accusations flew that it was them. I would note that in all the years I've been covering this as a reporter, I have never seen an internet mob correctly identify the person behind a shooting before the police or the FBI were able to do so.
Considering that so many more people are getting their news, or at least some part of their news, from social media today, how do the social media platforms see their role kind of going forward?
I think it depends who you ask. I think if you look at someone like Elon Musk, he thinks it's a positive that people are sharing information as they want. He considers it free speech, I think is the way he kind of frames it and discusses it, saying that journalists were arbitrators of truth, and that he thinks it's good that people share with one another, and that there is what he calls, I think, a free flow of information. I think there are other people like Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, who looks at his platforms and says, well, we're not really a news site. That's not really our responsibility. We don't want to be making the kinds of decisions that a news organization has to make. And so I think in general, you're seeing the chief executives of these tech companies veering away from kind of taking the sorts of responsibility that editors and that journalists would have taken and would have talked about taking when we make decisions about what to show, what not to show, how to discuss an active manhunt, how to discuss a situation in which a political figure has been assassinated. I think there's a lot of thought and experience that goes into how traditional news media covers that. That isn't necessarily happening in social media.
When you ask these different social media companies the kind of logical question that most of us had, hey, listen, you seem to have a few billion to spare. You're investing in this and that and the other thing. Why aren't you investing more in this? What's their usual response?
Depending on the company, they'll talk about the investments that they have made. A lot of them right now are talking about AI systems that are being put into place to try and take down these videos quickly, to try to find them quickly. I think when confronted with the fact that these videos continue to proliferate and are not really taken down in an effective way when there is a news moment, they'll always say that that's something that they're working on, that the speed of it is something that they're working on. And so I think it's very Silicon Valley speak of like, oh, this is a problem that we're fixing for. We're fixing for this problem. And there are people that work at these companies that as I said, I've spoken to for going on almost 10 years at this point, who still talk about how there are products that are being created or AI filters that are being created who's going to solve this.
I mean, in some way, I don't know whether to hold the social media platforms responsible, how much of it is a reflection of, I guess, larger cultural issues on what makes human beings want to watch these videos. What's wrong with the internet these days? I mean, is it a reflection of us, or are we a reflection of it?
I think we're living in a moment in time where there's been a bit of a pendulum that swung. I think that years ago we were looking, at least for me, I was looking at things like ISIS, and I was looking at the Christchurch shooting that happened in New Zealand. And we had this moment where the internet companies kind of came together and said, we need to fix this. Our pendulum is way over here. We're allowing too much, and we're going to fix this. We're going to take down stuff. We're going to remove this violent content. And in the years since, the pendulum swung, and a lot of these companies are saying we took down too much. We tried to limit free speech too much. We tried to control the internet too much. We're going to do less. We want to let the internet be more of a reflection of what people want. I think that as with everything, I think hopefully that pendulum settles somewhere in the middle, where there is a move towards creating more safeguards, and perhaps, especially around violent content, figuring out a way to say that people should make decisions. If they want to see violent content, there's probably always going to be a place for that on the internet, but it should not be something that just feeds automatically when you open up a social media page. And yes, and we do want free speech, and free speech is important, and we're going to still hold that as a value online.
Sheera Frenkel, reporter of the New York Times. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what gives us meaning in life? It is a question countless intellectuals and ordinary citizens have spent years pondering. Well, award-winning philosopher Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein says it's our desire to matter that drives us. She argues that this most crucial and basic instinct shapes our identity, culture, relationships, and even our conflict with one another. Goldstein shares her insight and analysis with our Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Beata and Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
About 40 years ago, you wrote a very famous novel, The Mind-Body Problem. Tell me how this book, The Mattering Instinct, came out of that novel.
Yes. So that was a surprise because I was a young, untenured professor of philosophy of science, philosophy of math. I certainly wasn't expected to write a novel, but it came to me. And it was very exciting to hear this other voice speaking in my head. And the editor who acquired it in our first meeting, he was as young as I, Jonathan Galassi. He since has become a very famous editor. And he asked me a very precise, acute question, which was this: your main protagonist is very good-looking, sexually desirable, very bright, very funny, and she's so miserable. Why is she so miserable? And I thought about that, and then I heard her answering me, and it was in terms of this concept of mattering. What she had to tell me was she didn't feel that she mattered in the way that most mattered to her. And that's what first got me started on this deep need that people have to feel as if they matter, and then the great diversity of ways in which people respond to this shared need to feel that they matter. So it was by way of this novel, which was considered by my colleagues to be such a frivolous thing for me to be doing. And in fact, it gave me what has been, in fact, my mattering project to try to understand this mattering instinct and the way that it operates in our species.
You call it the mattering instinct. Explain to me why it's an instinct.
It's not exactly an instinct, as I explained in the book. It's the result of two other instincts. In fact, one of the instincts is deeper than an instinct, and that is that all living things, in some sense, matter to themselves. They're going to be, first and foremost, striving for their own survival and flourishing. And that's kind of an organizing principle of all the instincts. And in us, we also have this capacity because we have these enormous brains that we've evolved for other purposes, but this brain has the capacity for self-reflection. So we can sort of step outside of ourselves and interrogate ourselves and think, am I really worth all of this attention that I am determined by biology to give myself? And that's what results in this mattering instinct, to try to prove to ourselves that we're really deserving of all the attention that we give ourselves in order to pursue our lives.
Is it evolutionarily caused?
Yeah, it is. I can tell. In fact, I even start further back than evolution. I start with physics, with the second law of thermodynamics, the supreme law of physics, that entropy increases, which means that all living things are constantly fighting against entropy. And so they have to be giving their own persistence and thriving top priority to strive to defy the law locally of entropy. And from that we get the laws of biology, and that can take us all the way, as I tried to show, to this longing to matter. But then we're left on our own. If free will exists any place, it's here. How we decide to respond to this longing to matter, to prove to ourselves that our existence is worth all the attention we give it.
Does it relate to empathy?
I think trying to understand how the mattering instinct operates in others is part of what it is to empathize, to try to get a sense of what their subjectivity is like, what it is like to live that life. We all know people live very, very different lives. And part of this narrative of how they're living their life is shaped by how they're trying to respond to this need to prove to themselves that they matter. For some people, it really is their social connections. It really is, their family. It's just, the need for connectedness and the mattering instinct are collapsed into one thing. But for others, it's their, it could be the relationship with God or something spiritual. And that's what really gives them the sense that they matter in the universe. In fact, that's a very grand, very full notion of mattering in the universe, that you were intentionally created by that which created the starry heavens above and the moral order within, in Kant's language. For others, it's who I call heroic strivers. It's certain standards of excellence that they need to fulfill in order to reconcile themselves with themselves. It could be intellectual, it could be artistic, it could be athletic, it could be entrepreneurial, it could be military, it could be ethical. Steve Jobs, whose inner life better than maybe he knew himself, had this statement, try to live to make a dent in the universe. This is the expression of a heroic striver. And then there are people who really think about mattering in competitive terms. It really means mattering more than others. They really see mattering in zero-sum terms. The more others matter, the less they matter. So it's a very competitive approach to mattering. I've been spending the last 40 years just talking to people about it because I found that the best conversations I can have with people just open up, and the stories they tell about their how they try to prove that they're not nothing, that their existence is something. Just the diversity is extraordinary.
Well, this instinct to matter in this cosmos in which we find ourselves, is that always a good and healthy thing, or can
No.
it be a problem?
It is. I would say, in fact, our greatest achievements as a species and our greatest atrocities come from this mattering instinct. And which is not so surprising, because I think it really gets to what it is to be human, what makes this species so different from even our closest primate relatives. And we are capable of incredible achievements, incredible, compassion and achievements and knowledge and art and athleticism, all sorts of things. But also we are capable of extraordinary atrocities.
How does this arise out of your philosophy of mathematics and science?
Yeah. Well, I try to be very precise about it. I was trained in analytic philosophy, and in analytic philosophy, rigor is very, very important, defining your terms. And one of the things about analytic philosophy, as opposed to what it's often called sort of a continental philosophy, these are outdated terms, but is that it takes science very, very seriously. And so to me, science doesn't destroy these questions of meaning and mattering and values and what it is to live a good life. It doesn't undermine them. In fact, we can use science, use the second law of thermodynamics, use theory of natural selection to try to gain insight into why we have this need, and then how we could best appease it. It's a longing. We never really know for sure. There's a lot of doubt in living a human life. And people who don't recognize this, who are so certain of their way of doing it and think everybody ought to do it, or they are nothing, they don't matter, they often cause a lot of trouble in the world.
Well, you talk about a lot of stories in the book, some leading down a bit of a dark path. Tell me about, I think, Frank Mehink was one of them.
Yeah. So he might be the most amazing person I ever spoke to. He came from a very, very poor background, a dysfunctional family. His mother was a drug addict. His stepfather was a brute who would beat him up. And he had a real sense of not mattering. And he came in contact with some neo-Nazi skinheads. And they told him, and they used the language of mattering. Look in the mirror. You will see that, of course, you matter. He was 13 at this time. He already dropped out of school. You are a white, male, heterosexual American. You matter by your racial identity, and these other people are stealing it from you. This was a notion of zero-sum mattering, so that, to the extent, but it was group mattering. The extent you belong to a certain group, you matter more than these other groups. And as they're rising in mattering, they're taking away what is rightfully yours. And so he became a full-blooded, full-time neo-Nazi skinhead activist, arrested as a felon at 17, put away, met some black guys in jail that he really bonded with. And he began to see through this ideology that had made him feel that he mattered. And he's still terrifically anti-Semitic. And he said, in fact, he held on to that with even more vengeance because it was the one thing that tied him to his sense of mattering, that somehow the Jews were behind everything. And then he met a very nice Jewish man who employed him when nobody else would, even though he had a great big swastika tattoo on the side of his neck and his knuckles spelled out skinhead, so that when he beat people up, they would know why they were being beaten up. He completely reversed himself. I would say, he became what I call an ethical heroic striver. He has devoted himself to trying to fight ideology. So he's just, people can change what I call their mattering project.
We have somebody on more the other side. I think it's Lo Shuaying. Can you tell me her story about being a scavenger but helping kids?
Yeah. We tend to think of heroic strivers, those who have some standard of excellence that they need to achieve. And that's what makes them feel worthwhile, whether others know about this or not. It can be very, very private, not public. And she, to me, is, it really exemplifies this kind of ethical achievement. She was a Chinese woman. She's now dead. I spoke to her daughter, Juju, and she grew up extremely impoverished. She lost her parents when she was 3 years old. It was during the Chinese Civil War. I don't even know how she survived, but she did. And she became a scavenger, picking up, garbage, going through the dumpsters for recyclables and bringing them to be recycled and earning her very meager living from this. Well, it was during the period of one child policy in China. And what she was finding in these dumpsters and public toilets and on the side of the road were babies, little girl babies who had been put out to trash because if you can only have one baby, well, then for various cultural reasons, families preferred it to be a boy. And so they left the girls out. And with a blank piece of paper pinned to them. And she, this impoverished woman, took these babies home and took care of them. She brought up at least 30 little babies, and she rescued many more and found homes for them. And it was so this was an extraordinary story, and it's the last story I tell. So you know what? We often don't pay attention to this kind of heroic striving.
Our society has been hit, we discuss it every week on this show, by populism, tribalism, authoritarianism. To what extent does that reflect in your mind a crisis of mattering?
Yeah, that's exactly how I see it, as a crisis of mattering. That our society, we have not paid enough attention to the fact that everybody has this longing. Everybody, wherever there is human life, there is a longing to matter, to not be nothing, to not be treated as nothing. And we've created a society in which there doesn't seem to be enough mattering to go around, in which, we talk so much about economic inequality, and that's a fact. But since we also judge how much people matter more and more by how much money they have, this has made people feel as if they don't matter. Maybe only the famous, the powerful, the rich matter, and this causes great resentment. The needs of mattering are being ignored, and if a leader can appeal to that, especially a leader who seems to be on a higher plane of mattering, very powerful, very rich, very famous, and say, I feel you, I'm one with you, you matter as much, especially if that leader himself may feel a dearth of mattering, being constantly needing to prove to himself how much he matters. So it's very, very authentic, this anger, but it's a shared anger, and you can, given the privation that many people are feeling as to their own mattering, it can create a very strong movement. I think we're seeing that.
Rebecca Newberger-Goldstein, thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Next to Australia, where the world's first social media ban for under 16s has taken effect, and not everyone is happy. Tech company Reddit filed a lawsuit against the government on Friday, arguing that the law is threatening free speech. In response, the nation's health minister slammed the company, saying that it's prioritizing profits. Steve Huffman is the CEO and co-founder of Reddit, and he tells Walter Isaacson about the purpose of his platform and why he believes Reddit should be exempt from the ban.
Thank you, Bianna. And Steve Huffman, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
You founded Reddit about 20 years ago, just out of college. What did you intend it to be?
Look, that's a great question. 20 years ago, it was a long time ago. There were really two things in our head at that time. One was, I think quite simply, we wanted to build a place that was controlled by users, run by users, where you can find new and interesting things online. So at the time, having a scrollable feed of interesting things that came from users was actually novel. The second was we wanted to create a place where humans were the editors, whereas traditional media is controlled by editors or other gatekeepers. We wanted a place where people could talk about what was important to them. But our aspirations back then were truly smaller than they are today. And so it's funny to reflect back on how much things have changed.
When I go on the subreddit for New Orleans or for science, the ones I like, tell me, what am I getting?
So Reddit today is a vast collection of communities. We call those communities subreddits. And communities, just like in the real world, are groups of people that have similar values, maybe a shared vocabulary. There's really a sense of belonging, or sometimes, hey, a sense of I'm not a part of this community. That boundary is really important. So whether in New Orleans, which is a community for people who presumably live in New Orleans, you're going to find a very distinct personality from what you would find in the science community, where the science community, one of their rules is no jokes. Reddit is a very funny place, but not in the science community. And I think
we have the opposite rule in the New Orleans subreddit.
Exactly. And that's really important. And there's also an important part of Reddit, which is every community has its own rules, in addition to our platform-wide rules.
You know, it sort of may be confused with social media, but when I'm on it, it doesn't look or feel like social media in the traditional sense, like a Facebook or an X.
That's right. And so Reddit, we actually predate social media, both the words social media and the platforms themselves. And so we've grown up in our own image. And so social media is organized around what I call the Fs: friends, followers, family, famous people. Whereas Reddit is organized around community. So you may be on the platform with your friends, but you don't know who your friends are. And so the incentives are completely different. On social media, people try to get credit for what they're saying. And it causes people to say things that are either potentially embellished or just simply not true. And on Reddit, no matter how popular you are on Reddit, you can't take it with you. It doesn't make you more popular in real life. And so the incentives are actually more natural. People are helpful, they're funny, they're interesting. And I think that it's actually a better reflection of how people are. If you look at social media, I think it's easy to have a negative view of the world. And one of my sadnesses is I don't think that's actually true. And when I look at Reddit, and I think one of the great things that I'm so thankful for in life is I've had a front row seat to see how people behave when nobody's watching.
Well, wait, so why are people less negative on Reddit than they are on X?
I think it's because people are less negative in real life. And Reddit maps, the incentive structure, how Reddit works, maps closer to real life. People are connected around things they care about. So, we've got everybody on Reddit, right? Men, women, left, right, nerds, normies, young, old, and parents, and sometimes their kids. But they're all existing in the places that they want to be. And so that community structure is what makes it work. And nobody does community online the way Reddit does.
Sometimes people refer to you as, for free speech, but you've said you're not exactly a bastion of free speech. Contrast that with something like 4chan or 8chan or other services.
Well, there's some nuance here. We believe in free speech, and I think it's an essential law in our country. In the United States where we're based, it's literally the first law, right? It's the First Amendment. But Reddit is not a country. We're a very, very large community. And one of the defining qualities of any community, big or small, is a boundary. This is allowed, this is not allowed. And so we start from that position of if it's not allowed, it is allowed. But that evolves over time. And so I mentioned the things like violence, hate, harassment, bullying. Those are not allowed on Reddit. And of course, there's a lot of nuance to those rules. But at the end of the day, we're building a community where people have to want to be. And people don't want to be in a place that makes them, feel unsafe. But again, there are viewpoints represented on Reddit that you may not like, that I don't like. But if they present those viewpoints in harmony with our rules, then everything's allowed from that point of view.
I was kind of surprised to realize that almost half the population of the United States, I think 190 million people every week, go to Reddit, and you do it without an algorithm serving up what's good. How do you make it that way without using an algorithm to keep people engaged?
It's all through the voting. And so the users vote up, what they think is interesting. And I think the funny thing about Reddit is we have this joke, but it's not a joke. We call it come for the cats, stay for the community. So at first glance, Reddit, it's funny. It's got some posts. It's a scrolling feed like you've seen 100 other times online. But if you go just a little bit deeper and start to read the comments on these posts, eventually users have sometimes profound experiences. But if you want to know what people really think, and it's not all super deep. Like, what should I watch tonight? What game should I play next? Right? Let's gossip about sports or pop culture. Reddit's take on all of these things, I think, is funnier and more interesting, and also often surprisingly deep. And so there's a richness there, but that just comes from people.
Do you think that you have to worry about things like AI slop?
Oh, of course. There's a paradox here. Reddit's content was used to create every LLM you've heard of. And then in turn, those LLMs, which are very powerful, and of course, we use top to bottom in our business as well, are also used to create just lousy content, AI slop.
And so you're talking about artificial intelligence companies, large language models, scraping the Reddit content to train their models. What do you do about that?
To some extent, there's no avoiding it. And so we've done agreements with Google and OpenAI to put guardrails on that content, right? Here's what you can use it for. Here's what you can't use it for. Because we want to uphold, our privacy commitments to our user base. And look, Reddit is the most human place on the internet. In the world of AI, our positioning is, no matter how useful the AI tools become, people will always want to talk to other people. And so that's what our product is. But that also creates a lot of value, which is if the AI wants to know something, well, it kind of has to get it from Reddit, because that's where people talk about what they know. And so balancing this has become very important. And it's very important for our platform to be for humans. Now, I can give you an example of good uses of AI. Translation, right? Translating our content into other languages, helping non-native speakers speak better in another language. All of these things are very powerful. But for a long time, long before AI existed as we know it, we've worked to ensure the integrity of Reddit systems, and particularly the voting systems. So we want the viewpoints on Reddit to be represented by actual humans. So there'll be a lot of change along the way, but that part is sacred to us.
And so AI companies training on your content, or for that matter, our content, because we're all Reddit users, or any other content, should the AI companies be paying for that right to train on the data?
I think there's a lot of nuance there, depending on, where the data is coming from and how it's used. But broadly, yes. Our view at Reddit is commercial use requires commercial terms. At the same time, we give our data away to universities, to researchers. So we try to be, I think, reasonable and permissive. But if the data is being used commercially, then yes, I do think commercial agreements are important.
What about this backlash against social media in general, which may or may not include Reddit, but say in Australia, they're saying 16-year-olds should not be allowed to be on things like that. What do you feel about that movement?
So I get the spirit of the movement, which is we need to do a better job, I think, protecting kids online and be more intentional about it. Now, I don't think that particular law is going to accomplish its goals. And I'm not sure Reddit should be included in it at all. And I think we're inadvertently preventing emerging adults from being able to be online. And so I think there are better solutions. And so at the end of the day, we always advocate for internet rights. We've long been an advocate of child safety online. Reddit's not for kids. Is at the end of the day. We call them emerging adults. So the kind of the tail end of high school into college is where we start to, pick people up. But I think there are better solutions using the phone OS, using browsers, having much more nuance in kind of where people are online.
President Trump's administration has been talking about making visitors to the United States, or maybe people who want visas, whatever it may be, show their social media for the past 5 years. The media on Reddit's anonymous. Would you ever cooperate with the government and so they could look at people's postings?
Well, that's kind of the point of the way we do things at Reddit, is it's anonymous. I want people to be able to be themselves on Reddit and know that if we were to get hacked or their account were to be taken over or we get a subpoena, that there's just only so much information we can share. And that's kind of the point of Reddit, is to let people be free to be themselves. And I say selves in a plural sense, because we all have different selves, right? I'm me as the CEO of Reddit. I'm me as a father on Reddit. I'm me as a video game player and sports fan and tool enthusiast. All these different personas are important. And I've gone through medical things here or there on Reddit that, will stay that way, right? Private. And I think that's important. That privacy promise is really important. And so, yes, we would take issue with that, both directly and I think more philosophically, on people's ability to have private lives.
Section 230 prevents platforms from being held fully accountable or liable for what people post on them. And from all different sides of the spectrum, I remember President Trump a while back tweeted out, repeal 230. And now Senator Sheldon Whitehouse this week has called Section 230 a vessel of evil. Explain whether you think Section 230 should continue to protect your company from things that people post that may be libelous or threatening or fraudulent.
So let me clear up a few things about Section 230. So it's known as the law that created the internet. And it was created because a platform prodigy was actually punished for making a moderation decision. They removed some bad content, some harassing content, and then they were punished for that. It was bipartisan legislation to say this platform was actually trying to do the right thing, and we should allow platforms to do the right thing. That was the creation of the law. And Section 230 doesn't prevent companies or protect companies from civil liability. So if somebody is wronged and feel they're wronged, they can sue us. Now, what it does is it protects us from frivolous lawsuits. So people go on Reddit, and let's say they say something like they don't like a product, they don't like a restaurant. What happens without 230, and we see these cases all the time, is instead of suing the speaker, it doesn't protect the speaker from libelous or slanderous behavior. Instead of suing the speaker, they sue the company. And what Section 230 says is we can create a platform for people to speak their minds. And we are protected from our users who speak their minds in a way that somebody doesn't like. I will point out that both Democrats and Republicans have come after Section 230, and every couple of years, their reasoning switches. So I forget where it is right now, but somebody says we censor too much and somebody says we censor too little. And then in a year, they switch sides because the other side is in power. And so it's always about they want us to censor more or censor less. And Section 230 gives us the ability to try to do a reasonable job in the middle. And I think we've done a very good job at that.
We're about to have our 250th birthday as a nation. And I think in the 20 years since Reddit has existed, to some extent, digital media has ended up dividing us. Not Reddit, but just in general more, making our discourse a little bit more crass. What extent do you think that Reddit can play a role, maybe in this 250th year, of strengthening institutions and democracy and civil discourse?
I believe that Reddit is a more natural reflection of how people are. And you can take two people, on the far left and far right. And if they're not talking about politics, if they're talking about being parents or being sports fans or what TV show they're watching, they will get along fantastically. There are so many ways for people to connect around things that are, shallow and profound. And I think one of the things that Reddit does well is lets people connect on all sorts of things rather than just disconnect on politics. And I think that's one of the big problems with social media is it forces this unnatural disconnection. People say extreme things they don't even believe when they say them. That is unnatural. And so I think the voting system of Reddit, the anonymity of Reddit, the organization in the communities, this all better aligns with how people are and letting them connect over things they really, truly care about. And so I really do believe if we're successful in our work, maybe we can bring people together more effectively rather than tearing us apart.
Steve Huffman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Walter. It was really my pleasure.
Our next guest is suing the Trump administration after what he says was a politically motivated dismissal from the Department of Justice. Former Assistant U.S. Attorney Mike Gordon believes that he was abruptly fired because of his role as a senior prosecutor on the Justice Department's January 6th Capitol riot cases. Gordon is one of many impacted by the DOJ's firings and its probes into those who've opposed President Trump. On Friday, the Justice Department announced that it was launching a criminal investigation into Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey over allegedly impeding federal efforts there. Mike Gordon joins Hari Srinivasan to discuss how the department's new path could impact judicial order.
Bianna, thanks. Mike Gordon, thanks so much for joining us. Recently, the Department of Justice has gone after who they perceive to be political rivals. The list is very long now. Whether it's James Comey or Letitia James or the Fed Governor Lisa Cook. I wonder, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, insists that these actions are, quote, driven by law, not politics. What's your assessment of that?
I don't see how that can possibly be true. So I served in the Department of Justice for 8.5 years. And while I was there was a mantra. That is that we follow the facts and the law wherever they lead without fear or favor. That's what our task was. And that meant that investigations begin with the facts. They begin with FBI agents and prosecutors seeing wherever they lead. And if they do lead to a prominent person, right, to somebody that's going to get a lot of media attention, for example, if we charge that person with a federal crime, then there are many layers of review that you have to go through as a prosecutor to get approval to charge that person, sometimes all the way up to the attorney general themselves. And that takes a significant amount of time. Sometimes those result in serious public corruption prosecution. But what doesn't happen is the reverse. And that's what I've been seeing consistently from the administration over the past few months, is starting with the target and then working backwards to try and figure out what crime they might be able to charge.
There are a number of sitting elected officials right now that are being targeted. Senator Mark Kelly, Senator Elisa Slotkin, and some House members as well, for a message that they had sent out to military members, right? And I wonder, what's the legal rationale here for these type of investigations?
Well, there's two things at play. One, the Constitution has a speech and debate clause that covers members of Congress and largely insulates them from being prosecuted or otherwise having the levers of government brought against them for things that they say in exercising their First Amendment rights as part of their duties of deliberating and legislating and bringing issues to light to the American people. The administration doesn't seem to have given any consideration to the speech and debate clause in these cases. In addition, the Department of Justice has its own guidelines, and those deal, though, with election year concerns. And they essentially hold that we don't charge people within certain time frames in the lead up to elections. But that doesn't seem to be an issue because the people the department has been targeting aren't currently in election years.
So right now, there's also a lot of news and concern about a high-profile investigation into Fed Chairman Jerome Powell. The president has been making several comments over months. Again, this is somebody that he appointed as Fed chair, that at his displeasure on what Federal Chairman Powell is doing. But when you heard that there was an investigation launched into Chairman Powell, what did you think?
I thought that it was pretty transparently meant as an act of coercion. The president has made no secret that he would like interest rates to be lower. And it's obvious why, because doing that usually gooses the economy in the short term. It carries long-term consequences, though, for inflation. Those may take effect after the president's already left office. So he's been trying to lobby, Chairman Powell to lower interest rates for years, even going back to his first term. That hasn't succeeded because the Fed is an independent body that's been setting monetary policy based on what they think is best for the American economy. And so President Trump appears to have turned instead to using the law as a billy club, to use the Department of Justice as a means to exert coercion over Chairman Powell. And that, to me, is not only anathema to what the Department of Justice is and what it's supposed to be, but also it should scare all Americans, because Chairman Powell is the target of the president's ire today. It could be any of us tomorrow.
Regarding the Powell case, we should note that U.S. Attorney in D.C., Jeanine Pirro, said on X that, quote, "The United States Attorney's Office contacted the Federal Reserve on multiple occasions to discuss cost overruns and the chairman's congressional testimony, but were ignored, necessitating the use of legal process, which is not a threat. The word indictment has come out of Mr. Powell's mouth. No one else. None of this would have happened if they had just responded to our outreach." One of the things that's been interesting to watch is when judges have thrown out indictments against James Comey, Letitia James in New York, because, again, I don't know what the statistics are, but that's not something that I'm used to seeing. The Department of Justice investigations, usually the homework is done before you get to court, right?
Absolutely. In my entire career, I never once had a case rejected by a grand jury. I'd never seen a colleague have a case rejected by the grand jury. It covers hundreds of cases. And the reason for that is the Department of Justice is not a shoot first, aim later organization, or at least it never has been. The way the Department of Justice works is you have to do all the work on the front end as a prosecutor, but then also have it approved by a supervisor. And if your target is somebody that is a prominent person, or if the charges you're bringing are those that are particularly sensitive. Those usually have to get approved at multiple higher levels, including all the way up in DC. And because of that level of vetting by experienced professionals who are taking careful consideration of all the relevant legal and ethical considerations, we don't bring cases that the grand jury is going to reject. The fact that this has happened is an indication of sloppiness. It's an indication of the department not giving proper legal or ethical consideration to what it's doing. And what I'm seeing from the administration is the actual outcome of these criminal cases doesn't appear to be the priority.
What does this do to, I guess, the overall credibility of DOJ lawyers? I mean, I don't know how uniform it is across the country, but I just assume that there is a certain deference that judges give to say, okay, this is a serious person. They've done their homework. I should take this piece of paper seriously. But when we see cases like this come out, what do judges start to think?
The credibility of the Department of Justice has been just gutted over the course of the past few months. Being a DOJ lawyer for many law students is the brass ring, is a thing they aspire to because they want to use their legal degrees to do good. In the Department of Justice, when you stand up in court, you don't say, I'm Mike Gordon representing a particular person. You say, I'm Mike Gordon representing the United States and all of its people, even the defendant, even the judge himself. That's a higher calling. Every DOJ lawyer could make more money in the private sector, but they choose not to. They choose to give up that money in order to do what they think is right. And that's the charge, do what's right every day. That's not what we're seeing anymore. And the Department of Justice is hemorrhaging people. Judges are noticing. They're noticing the change in the department. They are noticing that they can no longer rely on the fact that everything the Department of Justice lawyer says is the truth or carefully vetted. That kind of erosion of credibility is going to take decades to undo. I also want to point out what I think is happening to the confidence of the Department of Justice for American people. We've always been able to count on the idea that the government is instituting or enforcing the law without fear or favor. But now what we're seeing is the administration systematically gutting the prosecutions of civil rights cases, of public corruption cases, of white-collar crime, and of foreign bribery or lobbying. Those 5 areas of prosecutions are what give the public confidence that even the rich, even the powerful, even foreign lobbyists will be held to account if they commit crimes. But through memos issued by Attorney General Bondi, firing or reassignment of prosecutors, and the department's high-profile decisions, American people no longer have confidence that the law will be applied consistently to everyone, regardless of their wealth or power. And that is devastating.
Just recently in Minneapolis, we had 6 career prosecutors say that they resigned. And I have to say that they said that because that there is some conflicting information. The Department of Justice says there were no resignations at all, that these people were fired. That their concern was, as they say, that, look, they were tasked to investigate the widow of Renee Good, the Minneapolis woman who was shot and killed by an ICE agent, while declining to pursue a civil rights investigation against the ICE agent who shot Miss Good, right? And I wonder, what does that tell you about what's happening in the department when you have lawyers, at least groups at a time, deciding to resign or leave?
The department's losing some of its best, most ethical, most experienced lawyers. And the problem here, to be clear, isn't the fact that they were asked to investigate the wife of Renee Good. The problem is that they were asked or told or directed not to investigate ICE officer Jonathan Ross. Right? The mantra of the Department of Justice is to investigate and follow the facts and the law wherever they lead, without fear or favor. That shooting in Minneapolis requires that the Department of Justice lawyers investigate all of it, that a civil rights investigation occur to determine whether or not Renee Good's civil rights were violated. It is possible that a good faith investigation of that shooting would result in a decision not to charge Officer Ross with violating her civil rights. It is possible that a good faith investigation of Renee Good's wife would lead to a conclusion that she had done something to criminally obstruct the ICE officers. But that's not what was directed to occur here. The civil rights lawyers in that office were directed to not even look at whether that shooting was an unauthorized use of force, effectively a murder. Not even look at it. And instead to target Renee Good's wife. And so I am proud of those 6 prosecutors. I'm proud to call them colleagues in the Department of Justice because their actions show me that they cared about their oath to defend the Constitution and to enforce the law without fear or favor more than they cared about their own personal security or jobs.
Someone watching our conversation might Google you and say, wait, this is the guy who was fired while he was handling major cases, including the January 6th rioters. What happened? And then you chose to sue because you felt like you were unfairly or illegally fired. What happened in that? And where is the case now?
Sure. So I was the senior trial counsel for January 6th prosecutions for 2 years, from 2021 through 2023. And then at the end of 2023, I returned to my home office in Tampa, Florida, where I prosecuted white-collar cases, public corruption, cybercrime, etc. I've been prosecuting those cases for 18 months, when in June 2025, I was given a letter indicating that I was being fired, and no reason was given whatsoever, nor any warning, nor any due process. Regular folks might be at-will employees in their jobs. I certainly understand that, but prosecutors like me are actually covered by a law, the Civil Service Reform Act, that means you can't just fire us at will. We're not some people that can be fired without due process, without notice, without any merit-based cause. And so my firing was illegal. It was obviously retribution for my work prosecuting January 6th cases, and there have been news reports since then that have indicated that's the case. I sued because what the government did was illegal. The Department of Justice, the very part of the government that is tasked with enforcing the law, was breaking it to fire me. And while I had spent almost 9 years fighting to uphold the law by representing the government, by fighting for the government in court, I didn't change. The government did. So in order for me to continue fighting for the law to uphold it, it required that now I go against the government and I sue them. So that's what I did. The case is ongoing. The government has moved to dismiss it, arguing that I'm in the wrong court, that I didn't have the right to sue where I did. And my lawyers have responded and said that the government is wrong, that the government has shut down the other avenues to bring this kind of claim, and so the judge has the right to hear it. So right now it's pending, and the judge is deciding whether she even has the power to hear the case, not just whether or not I was illegally fired.
For the record, we reached out to the DOJ about your case, and as of now, when we're speaking, they have not yet responded with any comments. What went through your mind when you saw the president pardon everyone from January 6th?
It was shocking to me and devastating. Just 8 days before the president was inaugurated, Vice President J.D. Vance, or incoming Vice President J.D. Vance, was asked about the possibility that the president might issue pardons to January 6 rioters. And Vice President Vance himself said, well, of course you wouldn't pardon people who assaulted law enforcement officers. Of course you're not going to do that. And yet that's exactly what President Trump did. We expected him to pardon the misdemeanors. But pardoning people who assaulted law enforcement officers, who stole things from the Capitol, who plotted to overthrow the government, who were convicted of seditious conspiracy, a plot to overthrow the government, pardoning them just throws the country into chaos. It shows that nothing matters if you support the president. It shows that the president does not back law enforcement, that it's okay for them to be assaulted if the people assaulting them say that they support the president and that's why they're doing it. Those law enforcement officers are heroes. We should be having a parade for them every January 6th. Instead, they have to deal with the fact that they protected Congress. They put their bodies on the line, and those same members of Congress are willing to not only sit by while they're pardoned, but also refuse to even hang a plaque honoring them.
When you look at how the administration has treated the people who went into the Capitol on January 6th versus calling Renee Good a domestic terrorist, there seems to be totally different standards here.
It does. The administration seems to be supporting a rule of obey or die when it comes to law enforcement. And they appear to be painting Renee Good as someone who deserved what she got. I don't see how that viewpoint holds consistent with pardoning January 6th rioters who assaulted law enforcement officers. For example, Officer Michael Fanone was tased in the base of his skull. Officer Aquilino Ganell was crushed and had his shoulder ripped to the point that ligaments were damaged and he can't lift his arm above his head or play basketball with his son. His career was ended. Officer Daniel Hodges, crushed between two doors. In any of those situations, those officers could have drawn their weapons, but they didn't because they understood that if they did, it could have instigated a massacre. I don't see how the administration can celebrate the pardon and call January 6th rioters persecuted political prisoners or hostages, and yet view Renee Good as a domestic terrorist who deserved what she got.
Former Assistant U.S. Attorney and former federal prosecutor Mike Gordon, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, in the United States, the government remains shut down for a third consecutive week. Why? Because Republicans and Democrats are still at an impasse over a key funding bill. Today, it failed to advance in the Senate for a 10th time, and the stalemate is already having reverberations on the economy, travel, museums, and the payroll of federal workers. The Trump administration has now been temporarily blocked from laying off thousands of government employees. A judge called it politically motivated. Democratic Senator from Virginia, Mark Warner, joins Michelle Martin now to discuss how mass layoffs are impacting his state and about his fears of a looming healthcare crisis.
Thanks, Christiane. Senator Mark Warner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, obviously, we called you. One of the reasons that we called you is that we're into, I guess, the third week of the government shutdown by now. The president is threatening to lay off federal workers. It appears that there seems to be some arrangement to pay military personnel, at least. Virginia is disproportionately affected by this. I mean, you have a significant percentage of the workforce, the non-farm workforce, are federal employees, and you have the second largest number of military personnel of any state in the country after California. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, what are your constituents telling you about this? What are you hearing from them?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the military is getting paid. But remarkably, at least at this stage of this process, I'm hearing from federal workers pretty consistently that they feel like they have been traumatized by Trump administration. They feel that Russ Vought, the OMB director, who Trump himself has called the Grim Reaper, is really coming after federal workers on an unfair basis. Matter of fact, the president has no greater ability during a shutdown to fire workers than in traditional times. So they feel very much victimized. They want us to push back. We also believe very strongly that, the idea of that healthcare cliff that's not going to come at the end of the year, that literally comes November 1st when people get their increased healthcare costs and will have to buy in the marketplace. We don't have the luxury of waiting till the end of the year. Put on top of the fact that, the president of the United States has only sat down with the Democratic leadership one time on this whole issue. I know the president's been running around the world and some of these things he's done have been successful. I commend him on that. But the idea that he is not taking this shutdown seriously and sitting down and trying to work this out, I think is a great failure of leadership. And we could actually do both. We could deal with the healthcare crisis, get the workforce back in. And frankly, at the end of the day, the president continuing to ratchet up threats, if anything, I think makes not only the Democrats, but it makes the federal workforce more angry and more frustrated.
Do you think that this it creates a wedge actually between civilians and military personnel getting paid and civilians are not?
I hope not. I hope that the president of the United States would recognize that all of these federal workers contribute to the safety of our country, and whether it's in putting their lives on the line, or for that matter, inspecting the milk and the food that we drink or eat, that protects Americans as well. And having those folks not paid isn't fair or right. We have said for some time, this was an imminently preventable crisis. We knew the healthcare costs were going up. The administration knew. We've got clinics closing already in my state because of this fear of this healthcare cliff. Let's do these together. And there is a lack of trust, because so far we've seen, even when we reach agreement with this administration, we've seen the OMB director arbitrarily come in after the fact and arbitrarily choose which program to fund or not to fund. That's just not the way the law ought to operate.
So let's talk about the substance of this for people, because everybody isn't following this as closely as you are, and as certainly as people who are closely connected to the federal workforce are. The immediate issue, the Republicans argue that the Democrats are being recalcitrant and not passing what they call a clean continuing resolution, which keeps funding at the same levels as the previous budget. The Democrats say that the issue here is the expiration of these subsidies for people who buy health care on the Affordable Care Act marketplace. Without these subsidies, the cost to the buyer is going to increase precipitously. And that, as you pointed out, the timeline is coming up for these insurance premiums to be priced out. People are going to have to make decisions for their sort of budget. But in essence, both sides are sort of pointing fingers at each other. So can you just...
One of the things you just said, I got to take issue with.
Go ahead.
The idea that this is a normal CR just isn't the case. Historically, and we've passed a bunch of these, the Democrats and the Republicans sit down together, work out their deal, and then say, we're going to take a time out to finish them. None of that took place. Usually it involves the White House as well. The Republicans felt like we don't need Democrats at all, so we're going to box them out, number one. Number two, we've seen in the past when we've gotten close to these kind of shutdown circumstances, which are always an awful option, the President of the United States engaged. Biden engaged repeatedly. Actually, when McCarthy was the speaker, he used the speakership very much to his advantage in getting Biden to the table. Trump has had one meeting and then kind of blown it off. And the immediacy of the healthcare bite is such that people are already getting these notices. My fear is the Republicans want to not acknowledge the costs going up. They're afraid as Americans see these notices coming out, which will happen more in late October than in early October, Americans are going to across the country revolt. And the issue here again is it's not just the 24 million Americans who buy their health insurance through these marketplaces, but if we drive millions of Americans out of the healthcare system, and our healthcare system isn't perfect to start with, and drive them all back into the emergency room, that is going to collapse the healthcare system. Everybody's healthcare rates are going to go up. We want to avoid that. We can avoid that. But you got to get in the room and talk about these things. I don't think it's an unreasonable ask to say, let's sit down. And frankly, at this stage of the game, the one thing we do know is the Republican leadership has no say in this. End of the day, this is all going to be decided, at least on the Republican side, by Donald Trump. So we need the president's engagement. We need to sit down. Reasonable people can work this out, particularly the president coming off of a very successful effort in the Middle East. Let's see those make a deal skills work back here at home and avoid this healthcare crisis and get our federal workers back to
you've laid out the substance of the argument. You have to assume that the White House and the Republicans believe that the politics are on their side in this, that they are willing to risk people either being unable to afford health insurance, dropping out of the system altogether, et cetera. Why are they wrong?
Well, all of the data I've seen so far indicates that Americans overwhelmingly don't want the healthcare system to explode. Now, again, That's today. Who knows in a few weeks? But I think in a few weeks, the circumstance gets worse for the president because these hypothetical price increases, people are going to get the letters and go, holy crap, my rates went from $800 a month to $2,100 a month, which a couple in Roanoke in my state would receive if they make, roughly $80,000 a year. That is a dramatic increase. And I don't know how that improves for the president and his party, other than the fact that it's going to make more people say, hey, we cannot afford this dramatic increase.
The argument that the Republicans are making is that voting for the CR, the continuing resolution, is a way to buy time to have those kinds of conversations. Why are they wrong?
They're wrong because we've gone through CRs already. We knew this cliff was coming, and there was no engagement. We're operating right now under a CR. Well, actually, it expired at the end of the fiscal year, but we passed a CR back in March. There was plenty of time to negotiate this. I feel like there is this sense that the president feels so emboldened that he basically can blow off Congress. And one of the things that I've been surprised that my Republican colleagues haven't risen up and said, hey, we actually got to have a say on this as well. But frankly, there's not much of a Republican Party. There's a Trump party. And if there was real interest in negotiating on this, why didn't it happen before September 30th? And so taking a promise from somebody who hasn't kept their word so far, even when there was the CR in place and they've arbitrarily picked which programs to fund, how you go into that circumstance where people, fool me once, it's my fault, fool me twice, I'm a fool. And we've seen that kind of activity from this OMB and from this president in terms of cutting back on programs that were actually agreed on. There's not a lot of trust, as we know. Let's get the president in the room. Let's make this deal. I think you get a handshake in a single day. The details on how you extend the ACA subsidies will take some time. But I think you could get to a deal and get this government reopened right away. But it's not going to be based on some future promise to negotiate when we've seen a lack of trust, a lack of follow through from the president on so many items.
The irony being that, according to an analysis by the KFF Health News, the majority of buyers of these policies under the Affordable Care Act are actually in Republican states.
Absolutely. They're all from states that didn't expand Medicaid. And again, this is just on the Affordable Care Act. We've already seen the $1 trillion hit that has been taken to Medicaid, which again, curiously enough, our Republican friends didn't have kick in until after next year's midterm elections, where again, about 11 million additional Americans will lose their health care coverage.
You all have private conversations. I understand that publicly there are no sort of discussions going on, but I assume you have side conversations. You have people you've known for years. You've served, this is like your third term. You've served with people for years. Private conversations? Any private conversations going on? When you point this out, what do they say?
I've been part of every bipartisan group in the Senate in the last decade. I have great Republican friends who I know, want to get this resolved. But in today's Washington, no Republican senator or congressman, with the exception of one or two, will go against the president. They are not going to move in any serious way unless the president says so. So the idea that we could, in the classic way, the Senate would work its will with Republicans and Democrats coming to a conclusion and then go to the president, that's just not the reality of the world we live in today. Donald Trump controls every action of the Republican Senate. There is no independent actors. There are no independent actors. So no matter what good faith conversations are taking place, without the president's involvement, I don't know how we get this resolved.
But I guess I'm curious. Here's where I'm asking you to speculate. President Trump is very attentive to people in his constituencies that he perceives as being part of his constituencies, his base, as it were. So I guess the question becomes, why would he be willing to allow people to go without health insurance or see these premiums rise, at least the cost to the buyer rise as precipitously as it is projected they will? Do you have a theory about that?
I only know what was reported from the one meeting where the Democrats met with President Trump. And it seemed, at least at that point, the president was not aware of how dramatic this cliff would be at the end of October. I think he's probably got to be more informed now, but he's obviously been focused on the circumstances in the Middle East and Gaza. He's had been focused on other items. I hope and pray he comes back focused on this crisis at hand here at home. We're not going to make America great if we destroy an already challenged healthcare system. But so far, that hasn't come to pass. I mean, if the president sat down and had 2 or 3 sessions and didn't get to a deal, I think his position would be strengthened. Not urging him to come in and be adamant about not opening negotiation, but the ask that's being made is, let's sit down in a room and try to work this out. Isn't that a reasonable approach? Aren't you, Mr. Trump, supposedly the world's best deal maker? And his refusal to do so, I agree with you. I don't get it.
The Republicans, up to and including the vice president, have been arguing that what Democrats are really after is to subsidize health care for illegal immigrants.
That is factually wrong.
What are the facts of that?
Let me finish. That is factually wrong. I would hope the vice president would know the law. I know he didn't spend much time in the Senate, but the law prohibits any federal dollars going in Medicaid, in the Affordable Care Act, in any other program to undocumented people in this country. He should know it. To state otherwise is a lie. And it is, I think, frankly, disrespectful to the 24 million Americans who are about to lose their health care coverage.
And the basis of that is what? As I understand it, the basis of that is that emergency rooms, as you just pointed out, have to treat all comers. Is that the basis of the logic of that?
Right. That is a law called Intella that says if you show up at the emergency room, even if you don't have coverage, even if we don't know who you are, we're not going to let you bleed out on the floor in the emergency room. I think that is the law of most civilized nations. And the irony here is if you are going to take these 24 million Americans and drive them out of the system because they can't afford it and have them show up at the emergency room, all you're really doing is putting additional burden on the emergency room. That's going to also drive up healthcare costs for the other Americans who've got traditional private health insurance, because that, for the most part, comes in as what's called uncompensated care. The hospital has to eat it. That means it's going to drive up rates for everybody else. Some of this is just plain math 101. And the fact that the vice president is making this baseless, false argument, they have assumed for a while that there's huge amounts of their presumption is all of these programs must be riddled with graft, even in states that are controlled by Republicans, if somehow non-Americans are getting this assistance. I don't believe that is the case. And it would be obviously a great black eye for those Republican-controlled states where the disproportionate number of people are who are buying through the marketplaces. But the law is 100% explicitly clear. And again, I am disappointed the vice president doesn't know the law of the country.
Do you see any way forward here? I understand that you specifically on just getting to an agreement, your argument is, as your other colleagues are on the Democratic side, that the president has to get involved, get in the room and sort of and work it out.
But I also say, let me just quickly add, I don't think there's any Republican senator I've talked to who hasn't privately said to me, Mark, we got to get Trump in this. We're not going to do anything without Trump's approval.
But substantively, do you see a way forward that you could support? Because, there are Republicans who have been consistent. They just say, you know what, the subsidies are too expensive. Like, I've had conversations with Republican senators, and some of them are consistent. It's just too expensive. We can't afford it.
Yes. I see path forward substantively that avoid the cliff. And if there are reforms that need to be put in place, put us on a path to get those reforms. Avoid the immediate cliff of November. Put reforms in place. And frankly, one of the things that I've offered to some of my Republican friends, why don't we put into the debate as well? Because of President Trump's tariffs, many of our farming community, particularly in the Midwest, some of those same Republican states are getting creamed because China's no longer buying soybeans. We're going to need a 10, 15, 20, $25 billion assistance package for the agriculture community across the country. Why that isn't introduced into this conversation, I'm not sure why either, because, we're going to get this done, and I believe it will get done. And then the president could come back and say, "Oh, I forgot. We need another bucket of money." Why we wouldn't go ahead and put that into the conversation right now and get it all resolved and actually show the American people, and for that matter, the rest of the world, we can still function with appropriate checks and balances. That would be a win for everyone, I think, including the president.
Senator Mark Warner, thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you so much.